Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israeli soldiers kill Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu vows to continue fighting towards its end goal. U.S. President Biden and VP Harris are calling for an end to the war in Gaza. Asian stocks climb after better than expected economic data from China and more support from the PBOC. A brighter outlook for chips after TSMC earnings also provide a lift. Plus, Ethiopia's first ever IPO, we speak to Brook Taye, the CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, about starting an exchange with this debut and boosting the economy. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Shwana Versace in Dubai. The number one story, of course, is the geopolitical story and the evolution in the region after Israel announced that they had killed Yahya Sinwar. So we will be delving into that and implications for what happens next in just a moment. Before that, as ever, let's just start with the markets, because what we did get yesterday is the S&P rally fizzling out towards the end of the session. S&P did close above 5,800, so still on this winning streak as the market digests some of the better data that's coming through. U.S. retail sales surprising to the upside yesterday. That gave a lift to 10-year yields once more. We're sitting at 4.10 now. But also bear in mind that that wasn't the only bit of data that the market has been piecing together. We had the ECB meeting come through, and even though they cut 25 basis points, the interpretation from the market is that the signaling was still quite dovish. That had a reaction on the currency and more in terms of expectations. And then overnight, of course, we are getting more signals coming through from the Chinese economy. The Chinese GDP figures coming in line with expectations, but still for the first 9 months of the year tracking 4.8% growth. That is below the 5% target that authorities have set. So we'll talk more about that in the program as well. Brent not moving much in the last couple of days, still sitting below $75, but still down about 6% in the last 5 days alone. This is its worst week in a couple of weeks if we look at the energy complex. Switching over, I just want to also flag some of the moves that we've been seeing in FX, because dollar has been on an upswing recently. Today we're dipping a little bit. We're down about 0.1%, but over the course of the last month, up 2%. Dollar yen also in focus. We've slipped back towards 150, down 5% over the course of the last month too. So a lot of weakness in the yen coming through versus the greenback. The euro as well, sitting at 108 now, and there we are reacting to some of the weaker data that's coming through from the European economy, in addition to further rate cut expectations. And then gold, it just keeps going. We have broken through 2,700 now, another all-time high. So records week after week for the safe haven. But back to our top political story today. Israel says it has killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who was seen as the architect of the October 7 attack. The Israeli military says Sinwar died on Wednesday in southern Gaza, along with 2 other Hamas militants. One person familiar with the incident said Israeli forces spotted suspicious movements inside a building while on a routine patrol. A tank then fired on the position, and it wasn't until Thursday that Israel realized Sinwar was amongst the targets. The U.S. sees Sinwar's death as a pathway to end the war in Gaza, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to keep fighting until all hostages still held by Hamas are freed.
I'm standing before you today to inform you that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has been eliminated. The person who committed the most terrible massacre in the history of our nation since the Holocaust, the mass murderer who murdered thousands of Israelis and kidnapped hundreds of our citizens, was eliminated today by our heroic soldiers. And today, as we promised to do, we settled the account with him. Today, evil has suffered a heavy blow, but the task before us is not yet complete.
For more on this, Bloomberg's Dan Williams joins me now from Jerusalem. Well, another significant milestone in just the regional developments over the last 12 months, Dan. And this was, of course, not the first time that Israeli forces have tried to eliminate Yahya Sinwar. But what is emerging is that the operation itself was somewhat of a chance encounter. And it wasn't until much later that Israeli forces realized that they had actually killed Yahya Sinwar. Tell us what happened.
Indeed, it would appear that this very dramatic development was a function of happenstance in the battlefield of southern Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli Foreign Minister, saying on Thursday that it happened on Thursday, but the Israeli military gave quite a different account, saying it happened on Wednesday. Now, the two accounts might be married if you take into account that it may have happened on Wednesday night, perhaps just over the the midnight line. But I think there's no doubt that the actual discovery, the realization that Sinwar was among the dead, took several hours to set in. It actually began with unverified footage from the scene, images from the scene being circulated online. The Israeli authorities saying they were aware of this and they were checking the possibility. That's not the sort of statement put out by a warring side that intended from the outset to kill such a high-profile person, basically the leader of the enemy side. So I think what we're understanding now is that Sinwar apparently surfacing from one of the underground tunnels where he's believed to have hidden over the course of the last year of war, surfaced with another one or two people. They were spotted by an Israeli patrol. We're told these were trainee tank commanders. Who were actually seconded to the Gaza offensive, so not really an elite tactical unit sent in, young conscripts, possibly as young as 19 or 20. They spotted these gunmen, opened fire. One of them, Sinwar, was wounded. You saw the drone footage of him trying to ward off a drone that was actually sent in to check what exactly had happened. And apparently quite soon after that, a sniper shot this man in the head, and he was later discovered to be Sinwar. So not quite the Abbottabad mission that Netanyahu might have hoped for. Abbottabad being, of course, where Osama bin Laden was killed by US Navy SEALs some years ago. But nonetheless, an achievement, and the Israelis are holding it up as an achievement. It might also be worth adding 2 points of symbolism. The Gaza war began with a Hamas attack on southern Israel, a killing and kidnapping spree masterminded by Sinwar. That was on a Jewish festival that ended the long holiday of Sukkot. And this killing of Sinwar actually was at the beginning of that same Jewish holiday this year. So there's a sense of rounding it out. Also, that footage, the drone footage showing him sitting in an armchair in a ravaged living room of a bombed out house. Just 3 years ago, during the last, or at the end of the last war between Israel and Hamas, Sinwar famously went on an armchair outdoors, outside rubble, and sat smiling in front of the cameras to flash the V sign for victory, as he saw it for Hamas. So there's also a sense of closure there for many Israeli observers.
Yeah, which puts us nicely, the setup nicely into our next guest, Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Thank you very much. So to talk about what happens next, let's bring in Burcu Ozcelik, Middle East Security Senior Fellow at RUSI. Burcu, is it too early to start talking about the day after for Gaza now that Yahya Sinwar has been killed?
I don't think it's too early. I think that many observers have been talking about the day after for a very long time, and the desire for it, the necessity of it, and how essential it is. I think the killing of Yahya Sinwar now provides an opportunity, a potential off-ramp for Israel and for Prime Minister Netanyahu to start planning for the day after and to wind down the military campaign, the conflict in Gaza. The question is, will Netanyahu take this off-ramp and see this as an opportunity? The messaging coming out of the White House yesterday, I think, was very clear in laying out what the U.S. wants to see happen next. That is a negotiated ceasefire and certainly the release of the remaining Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. So that appears to be what the U.S. intention is. But the big question is what happens next? A question of succession, of course, following the killing. Who will fill in this void left behind after Sinwar's killing? And will the new leader have the ability to negotiate for the release of the hostages?
So let's pick up on that, because from the Hamas perspective now, they have once again have to appoint a political leader. Both of the political leaders, Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, have been killed in the last few months. A couple of names are being put out there. You've got the likes of Khalid Mishal, Khalil Al-Hayya, who, as we know, lives in Doha, and potentially other names that are also residing in Lebanon right now. Out of the names that are being put forward, is there a sense that any one of these individuals would be perhaps more open to a ceasefire deal and to the the release of some of those Israeli hostages? Because Yahya Sinwar was known to be quite resolute and stubborn on the negotiations front. Does this open up a window?
Hopefully it does. The belief is that the Hamas leadership, particularly in Doha, in exile, the international sort of outfit of Hamas, that they will be more susceptible to external pressure, international pressure from the U.S., from other members of the international community, but especially the Qataris and the Egyptians, who have been leading the ceasefire negotiations for some time now, without success. So the belief now from Washington is that the putting the Hamas leadership in exile in Doha at the forefront of the ceasefire negotiations may mean that there's a more moderate voice to deal with, because Yahya Sinwar was known, of course, as a hardliner with extremist views, and that he was an intractable leader and had sort of a high threshold for what he wanted in exchange for the release of the hostages. So there are a number of names being floated.
I was going to say that there have been several mediated attempts to get the ceasefire across the line. And we found out just in the last 24 hours that Antony Blinken will be returning to the region once more to help push forward those discussions. But let me just frame my next question by playing a little bit of sound that President Biden gave yesterday once the news emerged.
Now's the time to move on. Move toward a ceasefire in Gaza. Ensure that we move in the direction that we're going to be in a position to make things better for the whole world. It's time for this war to end and bring these hostages home. So that's what we're ready to do. That's what we're going to do. And I'm sending Tony Blinken to Israel. I guess he's going in 5 days.
So Biden's saying it's time for this war to end. Do you see the U.S. capitalizing on this window opportunity to successfully get a ceasefire agreement across the line this time around?
We're very close now to the U.S. presidential elections, which matters a great deal, of course. There's clearly, and we saw now from President Biden's messaging, that there's a desire for Israel to take this win, to say that this is a sufficient basis upon which to proceed now, to start winding down the war in Gaza, and to pivot, to shift focus to ceasefire negotiations and focus on the release of hostages. We saw the families of the hostages out on the streets yesterday in Israel. Clearly an urgent, palpable desire for the release of the hostages to be at the forefront of what Israel does next. Netanyahu, in his video message, stated that the fight will continue. And there has been, for a long time now, talk about what a decisive victory would look like. But arguably, the killing of Yahya Sinwar, who topped the list for Israel in terms of being the principal architect of the horrific 7th of October attacks, the hope is it will be a sufficient basis on which Israel will now decide to shift focus to the ceasefire agreement and wind down what's happening in Gaza from a military perspective.
And let me just ask you, because there are several fronts at play now, you've got an active front in Lebanon, you've got an active front obviously still ongoing with Gaza, increasing number of airstrikes in Syria, attacks on Houthi targets, and the widely anticipated response in Iran right now. To what extent is the ceasefire in Gaza going to de-escalate all of those other fronts in the region as well?
So there's an extent to which these are all interconnected. This is a multi-front conflict that Israel is under. The off-ramp argument is that the killing of Yahya Sinwar will ease the pressure on Israel in its sort of combat operations inside Gaza, and it will pivot more deliberately to Lebanon. We are still anticipating, waiting for what the retaliation will look like against Iran after the ballistic missile attack that Iran launched against Israel on the 1st of October. So those are ongoing. I don't think it's realistic to expect a ceasefire agreement in Gaza to necessarily end the confrontation between Israel and Iran, but it will certainly ease the pressure, and it will lift some of the justification that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been using to continue its war efforts, particularly in Lebanon, which is now under a huge amount of pressure, with Lebanese civilians suffering in the crossfire.
Yeah. Burcu, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Burcu Ozcelik, Middle East Security Senior Research Fellow at RUSI. Well, still ahead, Treasuries are steady after a sell-off as strong U.S. data fans doubts over how quickly the Fed will cut rates. Citi shares their market strategy next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring. We got a lot of data come through from China in the last couple of hours or so. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio standing by to just give us the reaction to the data that's dropped.
Yeah, we saw how the initial reaction to the Chinese economic data, there was a beat on the third quarter GDP as well as some of these September activity indicators. It did still represent a slowing in the Chinese economy and putting that full year GDP target even further out of reach. So the initial reaction in markets was negative, but then we saw the PBOC kind of swoop in a sense, by pledging monetary support, by talking about how it set up this re-lending mechanism for share buyback. So that is what helped to lift the Hang Seng as well as the CSI 300 into the lunch break with those slight gains. Now, aside from that, we are also keeping a close watch on some of these tech shares after TSMC's earnings and the raise to its revenue guidance. That's really allayed a lot of these concerns surrounding the sector. And no surprises how the TAIEX is outperforming today. Note as well how we're seeing the Nikkei pair gains from earlier on in the session as the Japanese currency recoups some of the weakness from earlier, gaining ground below the 150 level against the greenback, Jumana.
Yeah, key level there, 150. Avril, thank you so much. Now, Treasuries have steadied after heavy selling in New York as new signs of vigor in the U.S. economy led traders to trim expectations for Fed rate cuts. Let's bring in Akshay Singal, Citi head of short-term interest rate trading. Akshay, always good to see you. Let's start with the U.S. here. We have seen quite a big upward move in yields. There has been upward pressure the last few weeks. My question is this a reflection of the fact that the data has been coming in better than expectations, or is it the market accounting for the possibility of a President Trump?
No, I think it's much more on the focus of the improved economic data, and really, I think since the jobs report at the beginning of the month, it's really reset the expectations for what the Fed can and will deliver later in the year, and probably throughout 2025. And so I think when you look at Powell and his previous press conference and everything else, I think if the Fed had that September jobs data before that last FOMC, would they have still cut 50? Absolutely not.
What do you think where do you think the risks lie right now in the U.S.? Because, again, there has been a big repricing once again post that very strong NFP print, or stronger than expected NFP print. Is there a risk that the market actually is now too complacent about the future rate cutting cycle out of the Fed?
I think it's the markets and the Fed have been really kind of tricked by the incoming data. The incoming data from July to October has been quite volatile, showing a market deterioration in the labor market and then a remarkable pickup from that deterioration. And so I think because of that, it's really led the Fed and the market to have very volatile pricings. And so I think going forward, yeah, there is some risk that the labor market deteriorates further, and we might be a little bit complacent about that risk. But given the volatility of the data, I think the Fed and the market is expecting a little bit more caution in the cutting cycle, and so that's why we're pricing in, continued risk of between 0 and 25 for the next few meetings, rather than 25 or 50.
Yeah. Let's turn to the ECB now. I was talking about the euro earlier. Again, a lot of downward pressure coming through. Some of it is a dollar story, but some of it also is just a reflection of the weaker European data that's come through. The ECB event yesterday was interesting because the interpretation from the market is that Lagarde came out a lot more dovish in the press conference than the statement would suggest. Do you think there is a possibility ECB cut 50 in December?
I think ahead, before the recent spate of data, from the U.S. in that sense, there was more scope for either the Bank of England or the ECB to start looking at cutting by 50. But because of that volatility that we've seen in the U.S., it makes it much harder for either the Bank of England or the ECB to pull the trigger and go with bigger rate cuts because they've seen that that uneasy economic outlook, which can be very quickly revised up or down. And so as a result, I think it is prudent for the ECB to continue to cut by 25 in every meeting. And the bar to cutting 50 actually, I think, goes up. And especially as they have kind of switched to being able to cut 25 every meeting, there's no urgency yet to go bigger and cut by 50. If we do see signs of a recession, and Lagarde was quite clear that we're not heading into a recession yet in Europe, then I think we will probably open the door to 50. But right now, that remains a long way away.
Akshay, it's great to have you on as ever. Akshay Singal, Citi Head of Short-Term Interest Rate Trading, joining us on the show this morning. Well, still ahead this hour, Chinese data signals an economy still under pressure. We'll discuss the PBOC's latest response. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Some breaking news coming through. First, Abu Dhabi Bank results have come through. The third quarter profit has beat, coming in at 4.46 billion dirhams versus estimates of 4.09 billion dirhams. Impairments are up 50%, 909 million. The operating income at the top level came in at 8.2 billion dirhams, plus 18% year on year, again beating expectations. The CFO adding commentary that the bank is very well on track to deliver over 16% return on tangible equity for the financial year 2024. So those bank earnings coming through from the region. Let's switch over and take a look at how broader equity markets are faring. The S&P sort of fizzled out the rally towards the close, but still closed above 5,800. As we head into the European session, we've got European stocks futures indicated opening in the red, down 0.3%. So we'll get you up to speed on some of the main drivers of those markets in a moment. But coming up, Ethiopia's first ever listing. We talked to Brook Taye, the CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, about the debut and the country's goals to lure investors to rebuild the economy. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israeli soldiers kill Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu vows to continue fighting towards its end goal. U.S. President Biden and VP Harris are calling for an end to the war in Gaza. Asian stocks climb after better than expected economic data from China and more support from the PBOC. A brighter outlook for chips after TSMC earnings also provided a lift. Plus, Ethiopia's first ever IPO. We speak to Brook Taye, CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, about starting an exchange with this debut and boosting the economy. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Quick look at markets before we talk about the major development overnight here in the region, the killing of Yahya Sinwar. But what we saw was a little bit of a dip for the S&P yesterday, though we did close through 5,800, fifth week in a row that the index is looking at gains. So continue to go from strength to strength there. Yesterday we had better than expected U.S. retail sales. That was a catalyst for 10-year yields to move about 8 basis points higher. So we're sitting at around 4.10 this morning, just shy of that. Not a lot in the last few hours, but essentially a big upward yield move after the stronger data came through. Brent also just hovering in below $75. We haven't moved a lot in the last 2 days, but we're still down about 5% over the course of the week. This, as again, we've been speaking about some of the fundamental drivers, the weakness of demand, in addition to the anticipated extra supply that's about to hit that market, is weighing on the energy complex. Asia Pacific, the handover so far somewhat positive, up about 0.25%, though we did get China data come through. GDP figures in line with expectations, and some of the other metrics that came through, industrial production, retail sales, surprising to the upside. Switching over, let's just talk a little bit about currencies this morning. FX, the theme for the USD has been one of strength. We're almost back to where we were back in August. Today slipping somewhat, but again, the major theme has been USD strength the last few weeks. Dollar yen just shy of 150, so that's a key psychological level. We're down 5% just in the last week or so. Euro also losing some ground, and now we are at 108.40. All eyes on that ECB meeting yesterday. They cut interest rates by 25 basis points, but also signaled further dovishness in coming months. So the market is pretty much centered on another 25 basis point cut for December, but will they go bigger? That is one for euro investors. And then gold continues to go from strength to strength, up 0.6% this morning at another all-time high. So 2,709 is where we're at right now. But to further the conversation on how markets in Asia are faring, Avril is in our Singapore studio. Just give us the latest on how the reaction has been to the China data drop.
Yeah, we saw how the data initially failed to impress investors, the data out of China, that is. But what really stirred the markets were these positive headlines from the PBOC that it's starting share buyback and equity swap program. So that is actually what helped to lift sentiment in the wake of the GDP print that showed slowing in the Chinese economy. And September activity indicators, even though they're better than expected, keep in mind that this was when the stimulus blitz came in. So overall, it was expected that this was going to lift the mood. Perhaps October numbers might be more of a key to watch, because that's when that stimulus disappointment has been coming through. Already we have the likes of SocGen, for example, reacting to the share buyback details, saying that the real impact for now might be limited. And then you think of how all this monetary stimulus is helpful, but it doesn't fix structural issues. What China really needs is fiscal firepower. Still, we're seeing these gains in stocks. They are leading the charge in Chinese equities, but we are also keeping a close watch on the tech space after TSMC's beat on earnings, as well as the raise to the revenue guidance, and that is lifting the tech mood in this region, although we're seeing a bit of an outlier. Nikkei is pretty flat, and this is as the Japanese currency recoups some of the losses from earlier against the backdrop of verbal intervention from Japan's currency chief, Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much. Avril Hong in Singapore. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden says he is sending Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Israel as part of efforts to end the year-long war with Hamas following the death of its leader, Yahya Sinwar. The Israeli military says Sinwar was killed in a battle with its forces on Wednesday. He is widely seen as the architect of the October 7 attacks on Israel. So for more on this, Bloomberg, Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia, joins me now. How significant a moment is this in the direction of travel for this war that has been going on in Gaza for over a year now, and as we've been talking about, has expanded into other parts of the region too?
Yeah, I mean, very significant in the sense that it's been a year, and to some extent it's quite surprising just how long it took to kill him. I think his death was pretty much inevitable one way or another, although there was a brief period, I think, where they offered him safe passage out, but that was many months ago. But in terms of what comes next, no, it definitely doesn't mean the end of the war. And clearly the international community is hoping that this is some sort of catalyst for renewed negotiations around a ceasefire, the release of hostages. But the Israeli Prime Minister came out yesterday and was absolutely clear that this is not the end of the campaign.
Yeah, what does the Israeli Prime Minister need to see in order for him to be convinced that a ceasefire is the right path ahead? And where is the leverage going to come from? Is it going to come from President Biden, or is it going to come domestically? Because even last night you had a rally of thousands of families of the hostages calling for the release of the hostages and saying enough is enough, we need to see a ceasefire.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. One is, in terms of what he needs to see, basically it's a total capitulation of Hamas. Lay down their weapons, surrender, and hand over control over the Gaza Strip to either Israel or an international force of some description. In terms of the rallies, I mean, he's been facing those for well over a year, and not just in relation to the hostages, but you think before the events of October the 7th, there was these enormous rallies against the direction of travel in terms of the political scene in Israel, and that didn't change anything. So the leverage is not necessarily there yet.
Yeah, what about the successors to Yahya Sinwar? Some of the names that are coming up, one of them, Khalil al-Hayya, actually lives in Doha.
Yeah.
So I wonder, given the fact that he geographically is located in Doha, in Qatar, one of the countries that has been a key mediator in the ceasefire efforts, does that perhaps offer some hope that maybe this next wave of leadership from Hamas will be amenable to a ceasefire?
I think it just complicates the matter for two reasons. Number one, I think if they're in Doha or a similar outpost like that, it makes them much more subject to Iranian control. And remember that the ties between Iran and Hamas are not like those you've seen with Hezbollah. They are much more recent in that respect. So it furthers Iranian control potentially. The second thing is, would that person have the loyalty and be listened to by the fighters inside Gaza? There's a real question mark over that, of someone living outside of the war zone, whether or not they can command the respect of those inside the war zone.
Yeah, and all this happening while, of course, Israel is thinking up its retaliation to the Iranian ballistic missile attacks. So the coming days are going to be crucial. Bloomberg's Stuart Livingston-Wallace, executive editor for Middle East, North Africa and Russia. Thank you. Now, coming up, Kenya is in turmoil. The Senate votes to impeach the deputy president and agrees to oust him. More details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Ethiopia is seeking to raise $255 million, selling shares in state-run Ethio Telecom. It would make the listing the nation's first initial public offering and pave the way to starting a stock exchange. So joining me now is Brook Taye, the CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, a strategic investment arm of the government which controls the telco. And our chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zabazaja, also joins us from London today. Let me just start off by asking you, what was the catalyst that prompted the decision to sell down this stake, and how receptive do you think the public is going to be to it? What sort of public interest are you seeing in participating?
Thanks, Jumana. So the overall government strategy since 2018 is to focus on really optimizing our state-owned enterprises by bringing in private sector investors, liberalizing several sectors which were closed for many years, including the banking sector and others. And as part of it, we have decided to initiate the capital market exercise in Ethiopia by launching the exchange. And the first offering, Ethio Telecom, obviously is one of the largest companies in the country, the second largest in the continent, next to MTN of Nigeria, with over 79 million subscribers, 50 million mobile financial services users. So the offering of this 10% to the public, as you've said, with a strategy to raise a little bit over $255 million, is a way to make sure that we have a deep and vibrant capital market, with the exchange being launched by November, and it would allow us to also bring in private sector and government-owned companies to be listed, so that we will have one of the vibrant capital markets in the continent.
And Brook, just jumping in here, I mean, the strategy here, or give us a sense of the strategy here, because this is first going to be opened up to Ethiopians before it's opened up to foreign investors. I mean, why pursue this and really initiate this listing in this sense, in this way?
Well, obviously, Ethio Telecom is a 130-year-old company. Lots of Ethiopians have contributed to its growth, and we've decided to issue the first initial 10% to Ethiopians. But of course, once the exchange is operational on the secondary market, foreign investors will be permitted to participate on the exchange. But still, we have the 45%, which the government have decided to offer to international investors, still on the table. This is something that we're going to focus on and work through once we've completed this exercise.
Do you get a sense that, as Jumana was asking, I mean, that there is appetite in the international community to participate? I mean, especially considering the timing of which you've talked about, the Ethiopian economy has really had gone through transformation. I mean, is there appetite?
Initially, with this public offering, obviously, we're focusing on our domestic constituency, where we've seen already a significant amount of interest since its launch of this IPO in the last 2 days. As you know, 79 million people already use Ethio Telecom. So, and now you can buy this share using Ethio Telecom app. So there is already an interest in the domestic market. But in terms of the international interest, we've already seen several investors who are interested to come in and participate in the Ethiopian market in general sense, because you will have uncorrelated assets in Ethiopia from the global macroeconomic related turbulence. So we really are very confident that once we start putting several companies on the exchange, we will have a significant amount of interest. By way of explanation, we have over 30 private banks with over 450,000 shareholders, which we would expect to be listed on the exchange. Since we're liberalizing the banking sector, we definitely would see foreign investors, especially continental investors in the continent in Africa. We think that there will be an interest to invest on the banking sector and other state-owned enterprises that will be listed.
Well, in many ways, this is sort of a trailblazing deal and the first of its kind, paving the way potentially for others. What is your sense for what other state-owned enterprises may also be looking to IPO in the near future?
Look, from the Ethiopian Investment Holdings point of view, we have 27 largest state-owned enterprises under our management, under our ownership, and we've already identified 5 to be potentially listed depending on the equity story that will develop through the exercise of, with the help of the transaction advisors that we're working with. If the equity story is there, if the interest is there, and if the investment holding decides to list, we have 5 companies that we're already looking into. But others also, depending on the market interest and then our need for additional capital for expansion and acquisition that we're targeting, we will put additional companies on the market.
Just to finish up, Brooks, I mean, are you considering the macro environment when you think about the other companies that you're planning to list? Because, of course, Ethiopia is sort of at the behest of what is happening in the macro capital markets. I mean, how much of that is being factored into the other companies that you're thinking potentially down the pipeline to follow Ethio?
Absolutely, Jennifer. I mean, the reason why we waited until we've resolved one of the binding constraints in our country, which is the FX issue with the liberalization of the FX market and with overall program that we currently have with the fund, with the IMF, is the main reason that this exercise has actually transpired now. So the overall macro reform will guide us in terms of our decision of listing additional companies. But currently, I mean, we're looking at the economy growing robustly, and with the advent of additional FX coming in with FDI and other exercises that we're doing with our partners, we really think that the macro environment will improve. As such, will lead us to put in additional companies to be listed.
Yeah, very clear. Well, we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us on our show. Brook Taye, Ethiopian Investment Holdings CEO, and Jennifer Zawazaja, as ever, our Chief Africa Correspondent. Well, for more stories like this from the African continent, be sure to subscribe to the Next Africa newsletter on the terminal and our website and our podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following this morning. Kenyan senators have voted to impeach Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua and remove him from the office. The Senate upheld 5 of the 11 charges leveled against him, including making inflammatory statements to stir ethnic hatred and undermining the judiciary. Gachagua has denied any wrongdoing and called the impeachment process a political witch hunt. Under Kenya's constitution, President William Ruto is required to nominate a replacement who will be subject to the National Assembly's approval. The EU is selling an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Officials say the bloc is hoping to reduce Africa's reliance on Chinese loans through the $162 billion Global Gateway program. The EU says it plans to invest in transport, energy, and digital projects, as well as education and health. It comes as Chinese funding faces accusations of debt traps, exploitation, and corruption. And Netflix jumped in late trade after the streaming service added more than 5 million customers in the third quarter and topped expectations across all major financial metrics. Analysts had projected about 4.5 million new subscriptions despite challenges from last year's strikes in Hollywood. Netflix sees growth next year of as much as 13% from a mix of new members and price increases. And Hyundai's record India IPO has been oversubscribed with more than 2 times, with strong institutional demand making up for tepid retail interest. The sale saw initial weakness before picking up by the end of the 3-day period. The offering will raise $3.3 billion at the upper end of the range. The Indian unit is valued at about $19 billion, and shares are set to start trading on October the 22nd. Coming up, China's central bank kicking off programs designated or designed to boost market confidence, just as new data shows economic expansion slowed in the third quarter. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. The PBOC has started share buybacks for listed firms, a move to boost capital markets as part of a broad stimulus package. The news came as fresh data showed that China's economic expansion slowed in the third quarter. Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel joins us now. Maybe let's just start with the data that we've got out of China in the last few hours. GDP coming in at 4.6%, slightly higher than the markets had penciled in. Industrial production also surprising to the upside. Retail sales surprising to the upside. Does this indicate that perhaps China's data has bottomed?
Yes, that does indicate that. It does not necessarily indicate that this is a recovery in the making. There's still a long way to go on the fundamentals, and also kind of removing some of that scar tissue that many consumers still have, especially those who bought property. Property had some, slightly improved monthly numbers, but nothing to suggest any kind of V-shaped recovery. Despite all the stimulus and the moves by the housing officials and the finance ministry and then the PBOC, as you mentioned as well, they've been talking a good game, trying to put a floor on this economy, and they might have done that. The third quarter was 4.6% GDP growth, better than the consensus estimate, barely, though. 4.5 was the consensus estimate. But keep in mind that is still the worst set of numbers, growth number, 4.6% in 6 quarters. You have to go back to the first quarter of last year, 2023, that also had 4.5% growth. So there's still a long ways to go. But it is encouraging to see retail sales pick up considerably. Bloomberg Economics expected 1.7% growth in September. We got more than 3%. So that is good. And this is also pre-stimulus numbers. The third quarter obviously ended at the end of September. The stimulus started coming in late September and early October. So there are encouraging signs for sure. And there's no doubt there's more expectations, perhaps, of fiscal stimulus, a number that the markets can latch onto.
Yeah, and it really appears to be the case of a full court press here, because it's not just a fiscal stimulus, but several measures out of the PBOC as well. A new one this morning with a plan to start a facility for share buybacks. So how should we read that announcement?
Yeah, I think this is just another sign that authorities want to maintain momentum. If you look at the stock markets in particular, the CSI 300 had that big run-up, sharp run-up on the heels, of course, of the stimulus. But the CSI 300 is down 10% since that peak on October 8th. So some of that enthusiasm has petered out. The PBOC coming in and essentially launching a specialized re-lending facility to allow major public companies as well as major shareholders to essentially, facilitate, borrow from the central bank at favorable rates to buy back shares as a confidence-boosting measure. Now, though, the PBOC said it's up to the banks to lend that money and to take on the risk as well. And the question is, will those major investors and shareholders and listed companies take the PBOC's offer? Are they confident enough?
Yeah. And will there be take-up? A key question. Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel. And before we go, a programming announcement. The Qatar Economic Forum, powered by Bloomberg, is returning in 2025. I will be hosting the event from May 20th to the 22nd in Doha, where we'll bring together some of the most influential leaders in business and government as they shape the future of the Gulf. Go to QatarEconomicForum.com for the latest information. And switching back to markets, a quick look ahead as we piece together all of the information that has come through from China, in addition to the better U.S. retail sales data that came through yesterday, and the ECB cutting interest rates, signaling a further dovish path ahead, in addition to the geopolitical story of the day, which we've been talking about on our show, and that is that Israel have announced that they have killed Yahya Sinwar, a key political figure within Hamas. Lots of questions about what happens next and the implications for the region as we keep a close eye on its ramifications on oil and heading into the weekend in anticipation of the Israel response to the Iranian ballistic missile attack. So all of that to come. But that was it from our show, Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.